Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sustainable Solutions with Planet Aid, a podcast that explores sustainable solutions for the most pressing issues facing our planet and communities today. I'm Planet Aid's Communications Manager, Haley Chitty, and I'm going to turn it over to our host, Planet Aid's Communication and Content Specialist, Monica Johnson. I'll jump back in at the end to ask a few follow-up questions and tie everything back to Planet Aid. Monica, take it away.
Thank you. Welcome to Sustainable Solutions with Planet Aid. And again, I am Monica Johnson, and I'm going to be your guide for this journey as we take challenging situations and try to simplify them. And it's also an opportunity to talk to incredible people and organizations at the forefront of developing and implementing sustainable solutions. Change is not only possible, but it is essential, and it begins with understanding. And today we are so excited to welcome and talk to Jennifer Wang, CEO of Full Cycle Resource Consulting, a research-driven company specializing in capturing economic and trade dynamics within the global textile industry. And that is in order to advance transparency, circularity, and sustainability. And she is also a very sought-after speaker addressing social and environmental challenges, addressing them with empirical data and actionable insights. Welcome, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're so excited to have you. Just to kind of start off, we just want to, give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, describe your current work and your research focus. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you so much. I think you did a fantastic introduction previously. So my name is Jennifer, and I started the data collection and research firm called Full Cycle Resource with my brother, Richard. But my background has always been in last mile solutions, delivering water and sanitation in the global south. This includes like latrines, waste collection, waste recovery, waste recycling solution, from composting to plastic recycling, now with a focus on textile. So right now my research is focusing on what happens when you donate your piece of clothing. When you put that piece of clothing into a donation box, where does it go? What are the pathway? And what does that circular economy looks like?
It's really good because, that's something that a lot of people are very interested in knowing because, once you drop it in, it could go anywhere and people want to know, have that transparency. So let's rewind a little bit and go back to 2025. And you're doing a study for global textile wholesaler and reseller Garson and Shaw. They're also one of Planet Aid's resellers, just so everyone knows, and they do great work. So I'm thinking that Lisa Jepson, CEO of Garson and Shaw, or someone from her team comes to you about wanting to do a study. So what was the impetus for this study, which is called Secondhand Clothing Imports from the United States to Guatemala, a study of trade, distribution, and local impact? Can you just walk us through the key findings of your study and what they reveal about how textile reuse actually operates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think before we jump into like the detailed finding, I just want to paint a picture of what Guatemala in terms of the economy looks like. So the population is 17.6 million people, and it's characterized by a high level of informality. So 71.1% of the population employed working in the informal markets. So in 2023, according to World Bank, is that 55% of the population live in poverty, with multi-dimensional poverty affecting over 61% of the population. So because of this household budget constraint and limit capacity for discretionary spending, contribute to sustained and demand affordable cost clothing, reinforcing the strengthening of the secondhand clothing market. So that's just a really important context.
Right.
And now I think we want to dive into, because you do supply clothing to Garson Shaw, and US is actually 98.1% to 99% of the secondhand clothing supplier. So let that sink in. So that is a lot. And so what it means is that the quality that gets imported into Guatemala is a good indication of the clothing that's donated in the US. And so I think that's why we said, okay, let's start with Guatemala for the study. So that way we have a good image of what is really happening. How does the supply chain absorb the clothing, and whether, price sensitivity plays into the supply chain. And that's exactly what we found. So we saw that out of the imported volume, actually 91.8 to 88.1%, there's a reuse rate of that. So that means that clothing that gets imported actually finds a buyer and a user. So that's a positive finding that we found. And another thing that I wanted to highlight was that what we also found was very interesting was that there's a high percentage of women working in the trade in Guatemala compared to the national economy more broadly. So that's been really exciting for me, obviously, because I'm a woman. Um, so the respondents that we surveyed, 46% said that this is the primary earner in their household, meaning this job that they're doing in an informal trade is the only income for that family. So that's really important. So this trade is essential for them. And so that actually they said that there was among all the widow respondents, this is the most important economy supporting factor for them, for their family, and that their family household depended on it, and that there's a source of independence and stability for them to afford education, housing, and other spending for them. So those are just the larger big picture of what's happening in Guatemala. I think that oftentimes we really ask ourselves, I think I wanted to take a step back into the US supply chain, right? It's because Guatemala is very unique when it comes to how they import clothing. And it's really important to understand there are two types of clothing that people typically import. So what the first one we called is called credential or original in depending on the contact. That means the clothing are in the original form of how you donated. So when you put your clothing into the donation box, they compact it. They may first screen out some textile waste or whatever items that don't belong inside, and they don't go into detailed sorting, and that gets transported into countries such as Guatemala. The second type of clothing is called what they call in Guatemala called clasificado. That means fine sorted clothing. So that means you have to sort it through a formal system where the sorters are typically trained over 6 months to learn how to define quality. And then the buyers in the receiving country then would buy that sorted clothes. And typically that's a bit more expensive because obviously it costs laborers, factory, there's operational costs that comes into that. So it's really important to know that the market imports both, but mass majority is actually what we call the original clothes, is what you put in a donation box. And it's important for us to understand that because when it gets donated, it gets shipped to an importer there. And oftentimes they have their own sorting process, whether it's in the formal system or in the informal markets, because they want to sort it according to the quality, to the pricing, to their customer demand before they redistribute or before they put showcase on their shops, right? So that's really, really important for us to understand. And because of that, original clothing gets to get imported in Guatemala, it actually creates a lot of formalized jobs. So it's really important that informal sector exists, but also really important that we're able to formalize the informal sector. And so this is what we saw in Guatemala, that these sorting facilities offer employment, they offer transportation, they offer food, they offer training and career pathways. They do a lot of investments in their staff to be able to operate at such a large scale. So that was really, really great to see. And I think these are the really important findings that we found in Guatemala.
And you said so much in that because I think about, I've heard some of these stories as far as the women who are getting the employment and becoming the breadwinners for the family, which is absolutely fantastic because that in itself justifies the need for this market to exist. So I love that. But then there's also all these, like you said, these formalized jobs. I love that because then that means that the market is just going bigger and you can have all these little thrift stores and that's more employment for people.
Yeah,
If I'm summarizing this correctly.
definitely. And I think globally you see that when it comes to sorting facility, I think the beautiful thing is that in the receiving countries, a lot of the sorters are typically women, actually, most of the workers, because they have an eye for texture, for the clothing style, the trend. So they typically pick up this trade much faster. So it's just a really wonderful way of women who may not have access to education. That's what we saw, is that education is not a limitation, whether for the formal market, such as these sorting facility we saw in Guatemala. They don't have any requirement for whether you can read or write or not. It's just as long as you know clothing and style, you're willing to learn, you're trainable, you can get employment. And this is also saw in the informal market for both, in East Africa and in Guatemala, that it doesn't inhibit you from becoming successful in the trade, which is amazing.
Okay, so what role does data transparency play in evaluating textile reuse systems, and why is it so critical?
Okay, I'll be very honest, is that I know that when people hear the word data, it's just a snooze fest. I'll be very honest, that was me in college also. It's just statistics class. I'm like, oh, it's very boring for me. But as I work in the industry longer and longer to scale sustainable solutions, is that it's actually the backbone of making good decisions. So if the data is not transparent or clearly defined or accurately collected, it creates really misleading narrative, and that influence policy, funding, public perception, even really impacts the livelihoods of those who may not have a voice or have an opportunity to speak up. So in textile reuse sector, I would say that small differences in methodology definition or service design can actually have a dramatic change in the reuse sector. So that's really important for us to understand that. And I have like a few more points I wanted to highlight when it comes to how important it is, because this is probably what often people see online right now. I think most of us are very invested, is this textile waste percentage is one of the most emotionally and heavily debated issue in our sector right now within our discussion. And I think from a scientific point of view, it vary really differently, as I mentioned earlier, based on the methodology, the sample size that you collect, the definition, the assumptions, and the perimeter of the study. So the reason why it is because why there is so much emotional charge of this is because how waste is defined and how it's measured actually carries significant economic, institutional, and political implication when it comes to this, because it shapes where the direction and policy and also where the funding, where it is going to flow in the future, right? The funding allocation of, infrastructure or technology or whatnot is going to be impacted by these studies. So that's why transparency is so crucial when we're talking about textile reuse system. And I think we need to really emphasize is that when people do publish paper, we need to ask those questions. Like I said, the transparency part. What is your sample size? And also what is the underlying intention? I think everyone has good intention, but I think if it's taken out of context, I think it can be misunderstood or oversimplified. So that's kind of what I think of the role of data transparency. So yeah. And good data for me doesn't just help measure problems. I think it helps us understand really the reality on the ground, like in Guatemala, right? It helps us understand like market dynamics, how is it impacting the livelihoods, the infrastructure gaps, and what are actually like the solution that we could do intervention, and what is feasible and what is not feasible.
Truth in textile use ecosystems is very important. And I think part of that leads to why people are very interested in producer responsibility as well, to be able to kind of gather the right kind of information so that we can make sure that we're accounting for the waste that really is there. Because sometimes people don't really think the waste is as crucial as it is. I love that the gaps need to be accounted for, but we also need to understand the sample size and things like that as well.
Yeah, it's like context pieces are really important. All these things needs to be considered. Yeah.
What are the risks of relying on incomplete or inconsistent data when assessing sustainability claims in fashion and textile industries?
That's a really good question. I think is that one is that the major risk on relying on incomplete or inconsistent data is that it leads to sustainability claims or policies or interventions that don't actually reflect on how the supply chain actually operates. So if the data only capture one stage of the system or use overly broad terms or oversimplifying high complex reuse or recycling system, it can have unintentional disruption of the supply chain of the livelihoods. And so that could really decrease the volume of exportation or importation. It could make, the profit margin for the receiving countries, such as the women who are buying and selling these clothes, become slimmer and slimmer just because of a upstream decision that's being made. And so I think what's really important for us is that as we are looking at EPR scaling, or if you're looking at intervention, is that we really need to understand the operational feasibility and economic feasibility, because I know that there's a lot of emerging technology that has been taught into this sector, but in reality is that the scalability is still don't exist, meaning the buyers are not there. These are great ideas, and I don't want to discourage people to say these are not something we're aiming for long term, but we also need to accept the reality of the world that we live in right now currently. It's like there's a future aim that we have, but doesn't mean that we should change the policy drastically to interrupt what is working right now. It's like, let's see the feasibility, let's test the cost of it, let's make sure it works in the context we're operating in, so that way it doesn't really hurt the receiving countries of those livelihoods that they do live off this. I think that's kind of what the major risks are.
So I just have a question just concerning that, because I hear you saying that innovation is great, but there are things that, because the scalability isn't there, then that might reflect in cost being driven up higher. And I'm thinking a lot about some of these new sustainable, like you're using denim and recycling it over and over again. And maybe that technology is going to cost more. And so that means that it's going to cost more for others to be able to buy it. Am I kind of in the right track, or is that a little different?
It's like, I think the goal is obviously globally, we want to promote like the waste hierarchy, right? You always want to have more reuse, more recycling, and then less item that's sent to incineration, just because we have less and less resources. And so I think the question with policymakers, like, okay, how do we increase these reuse? How do we increase recyclability? So when you talk about this denim, is we're talking about composition. So there is a lot of talk about whether we should, you know, have composition sorting, right, at the reuse level, but it's not feasible just because that is a complete different skill sets that they need. That's number one. So meaning when you sort for reuse, they don't sort by composition. When we are consumers, we don't really go to the shop and say, is it all cotton? We just say, wow, the style looks great. I'm going to look fantastic. I'm going to feel good. I'm going to look great when I go out. It's not, okay, is this all, 99% cotton t-shirt, right? We don't think that way. And that's the same way for reuse. So if you want to add, say, we want to increase recycling or add tracking system or traceability on fiber, then this becomes really difficult because one, the technology is not yet fully grown into place. Two, it's probably going to add additional step that means more cost for the consumer to buy. And also maybe in that market, in the receiving market, they don't have the recycling capacity to even, they can maybe open the fiber, but no one's going to buy that material. So there's just so many questions that comes into the system.
It's very good.
If that
Very
makes
good
sense.
answer. Yes, it does. It was great. For completing your 2025 study about secondhand clothing imports from the US to Guatemala, you did an extensive study in Tanzania about the secondhand clothing trade and the reuse rates, waste management, environmental impacts. Could you give us a few highlights from the study of this market to help us understand how local impacts differ from country to country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, because remember we said Guatemala imports what we call unsorted clothes, but whereas now in East Africa, so the study was based in both Tanzania and Uganda, they require fine sorted clothes, meaning clothing that has been sorted through multiple steps and inspection processes before they're allowed to be imported. And what's been interesting is that the informal market operates actually really similarly. So in Tanzania and Uganda, just like in Guatemala, when they receive the sorted bale, they still open it and they still sort it again in the local context because of different pricing, right? Because some items just will sell more and some item will just sell a little bit less. And so what we found was that there was some similarity in practices, and you can also see the similarity with the US, just like in US retail shop. There is a full price item and there's a sales, racket, right? I think
Hmm.
it's called racket. Yeah. So then it goes, you know that when you're toward the end of the season sale, it's like it goes 20, 40, 60, 80, 90% discount sale. And then there's the final clearance sales, right? This is the same concept in Uganda and Tanzania. That's what we found. And because of this, the retailers are able to extract, they keep selling their items, and then they have a final sale, just like in the US, in Guatemala, they call the liquidation, and locally they call fagia. So they sell it by the pound or the kg. Like in US, they sell it by the pounds to a outlet. Maybe an outlet buys it and they keep selling it, or like a discount shop, they will keep selling it. Just like that in East Africa. So because of the supply chain, we saw that actually about 96 to 95.5% of the goods are sold for reuse. 2.9 to 3.2% are sold for wipers and rags, and only 1.21 to 1.3% they just couldn't find an economic value for it, meaning they couldn't find a buyer for it. And what we seeing and we suspect that 1% is often because clothing are sorted by humans. And so we make mistakes, right? So because these buyers are it's such a competitive industry. It's so competitive and they're very outspoken. They're always negotiating in the market. It's that they don't want items inside that don't have a value. So they work with their exporters for a long time to negotiate quality, to make sure it matches with their buyers. And this is built through a long term relationship. And this is also similarly saw in Guatemala. Even though they're buying credential clothing, meaning unsorted, but they know who their suppliers are, and this is a long-term relationship. And so if their sorting facility is seeing a quality change, because they're also collecting data on their shipment to say, "Oh, this consignment has this quality," then if the quality changes, they immediately convey it to their supplier, which is Garson& Shaw, and say, "Hey, by the way, there's been a change. What is going on?" That relationship is so tight knit, and they're always in communication. So we ask them, how often do you communicate with your supplier? They say every week. We talk to them every week, just to, if there's a needed, even more frequently. It's a long-term relationship that's built, because that also comes with credits, finance option directly from your supplier. They'll give you better terms and stuff. And so that was really interesting for us to see the impact from one country to another. Both countries, as I mentioned earlier, has a high concentration of women working. So that was, really positive to see. I think I'm suspecting this low barrier to entry. And what's been really great to see was that, when women in the informal markets, they may not have a lot of money to start with a capital. So they may only have like $10, $20. So what they would do is they would buy pieces. They become the selector. So they go to someone who opens a bale. They go there to pick out the pieces they want and they go sell it. What we saw in the Uganda and Tanzania studies is that the probability of them become a bale buyer is almost as I think within 5 years was like 80% of them like they move upward in the
Wow.
in the supply chain. So that means that they are saving money and they're able to, invest more money and become a bigger operator. We work with a guy there, and he was actually a cleaner. So he started off his career as a cleaner in the importing offices. Like they have a building of all the importers. He was just cleaning the floors. And one day an importer said, "Do you want to come work with me to help me, move my consignment to carry it?" So he worked as a bale carrier and he started selling. And then he worked with me on the research to kind of teach us how does the supply chain works, take us to the retailers. And then within a year afterward, now he's actually distributing bales himself. That was really amazing to see for him to be able to save up now to buy his motorbike. He's able to pay for his brother's school fees, and that was a really a true testament of someone that we work with so closely to see him go from a cleaner to bale carrier to selling bales, and now he's distributing bales. That was just really incredible to see, all within I think a span of a year and a half or 2 years.
That's awesome. That's
Amazing.
a great track of upward mobility.
I think he was also really determined too, but it was amazing to see. Yeah.
That always helps. So finally, how can organizations, well, not finally, I have one more question after this. How can organizations improve transparency and accountability in textile reuse systems? And I know that I'm sure that that can go in many different areas.
Yeah, I think, okay, so I like to think this is the way how I operate when it comes to like waste management, recycling, because I come from a waste management background. I always think that people want to do good and people have good intention. I do believe that as human we have good intention, in general. And that organization want to be transparent and they want to they feel accountable for their own business and they feel accountable for the impact they have. And I think a lot of times that they may not know how to do it. I think the question is like how and where do we start? And I think a lot of business owner, I think this is one of the things that I keep hearing is that we're so busy trying to survive with all the policy and trade dynamic changes. We just don't have time, right? They don't have time. So it's like, where do they start? I think that's the question I keep getting asked. We want to do something good, but we just don't have time. We don't know what to do. So I always tell them is like, okay, try to see what data do you really have already in terms of like what are you collecting so far and what do you think is missing. So I work with organization to help them track the sustainability data. How do you recycle more of the waste that you're generating? How do you procure better? Is there any packaging changes that you can do in terms of your manufacturing to help you become more sustainable? They're so busy with their day-to-day operation is that they may not have the time to take a step back to think, okay, what is it I need to do to create more transparency and accountability to the system. So I always tell them is like, okay, the first thing you want to do is always to look in-house to say, okay, if you are an organization, maybe just look at what are you procuring and what is the data you're already collecting, like how much volume, where is it being sent to? If you're sorters, what data do you have existing and what data might be missing to kind of capture that? And number two is also working with a supplier to say, okay, what data are you collecting? Obviously sometimes there's a bit of like I don't want you to know my buyers or this and that, but there is a ability for trust to say, okay, is there any way that we can link our data system and we protect our internal data to communicate with one another as this global demand of traceability is happening? So that's number one. I think just take a look at in-house what's missing and what do you need to convey when it comes to, do you know where your goods are going? Have you maximized your reuse, have you maximized reuse and recycling rate? Those are just basic questions you can start with.
So how does that benefit them though? When they think about it, collecting that data, how is it actually going to benefit them? Because I
That's
know
a
that, obviously if you're going to take time to do certain things, you want to know that there's a benefit that comes with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think let me answer it from the perspective of maybe global north, meaning like a retailer, like someone who has like a charity retail shop. Is that okay? Like from that perspective. So obviously that how the supply chain works typically is that you get the donated clothes and it goes into the charity retail shop and the either is sorted before or sorted at the shop, right? You have the appropriate pricing, then it gets discounted through multiple different like cycle, and then you have the last liquidation. And sometimes what people would do is that they would resort it at the shop again or at consolidation warehouse to see like where the goods go. So they would sort out like the textile waste, they would sort out items. I think it's important is that if you can't find, sometimes they can't find a buyer just because if you're new to the game, if you don't know the industry, you don't know who to sell your goods to, it's always really good to just talk to, go network to see like, can I, instead of like sending what I can't sell to like incinerate or do something with it, could I send it to someone who specialized in this and invite them to come over to say, is there reuse factor in this? Can I turn it into wipers? Right? There's a huge wiper demand. There's so many ways to value extract in that. So I think number one is first understand your input volume, output volume, and where it goes to. Then I think it's for you to talk to other industry players, and then everyone is actually willing to share. Like there's not a lot of trade secrets in this industry. I feel like people are really willing to share. Like here's what you need to do because the market is so big, and that way you can one increase that reuse pathway. It's better for the environment. Number two is that you can generate more income, right? If you sell it to someone who is in wiper, instead of incinerating this item, you're able to find a buyer and give it a second life. I think that's really important. Obviously they're going to tell you the requirements that they want, so you have to follow that. So I would say that would be the benefit of it, is to value extract.
Finally, what changes, whether in policy, industry practice, or consumer behavior, do you think are most urgently needed to improve trust and effectiveness in textile reuse?
I think one is, I'm going to talk about like industry practitioner first, is that you can no longer just focusing on your business quietly. I think it's important for people to share data and tell their stories as an operator. Tell your stories because you don't want others to shape your narrative for you, and you just want to have that transparency and that trust with your people who are donating the clothes to you. You actually have a very good story, you have a very great impact, just because I think most of the organizations that are operating, such as you all, is that you're an NGO, you're a charitable collector, your donated clothes not only is an environmental initiative, it's also a financial mechanism that supports like a broader humanitarian development community work that you're doing. So tell the stories to everyone, because these programs, when someone donates a piece of clothing to you guys, it does help with poverty alleviation, healthcare, education, employment, disaster relief, so many things. So communicate your story and try to collect as much data as possible. And I think as like the other part of it is that because that the sector operates in such a complex, situation, because you have to navigate with your social impact objective, the environmental goal, and operational realities, is that I do think that policymaker needs to have a more balanced conversation, is to encourage, incentivize, and also look at perhaps things are being highlighted as room for improvement rather than a punitive punishment for someone, because I think most operators do intend well. And I think as public is that it's really important for us to ask questions, just because we live in a world of misinformation, AI content. It's just so hard to know what's real, what's not real. Is that we really need to be cautious of simplified figure, catchy news title, because I think negative news sells a lot easier. I think good news just don't get passed on as fast. Like a negative news just goes viral so quickly is that I think we get lost in the headline. Even the other day, I was asking myself, like, am I just lost in the plot with all these debates? It's like, what is the overall objective? Because textile reuse it's really complex. It involves affordability, involves livelihoods of the people, involves trade, involves circular economy goal. It's multidimensional, involves waste management. So as a reader, when we're reading it, we may be caught up with the objective of the writer. So it's important for us to take a step back and say, okay, is this a simplified thing? And ask those critical questions, right? Whether it's with the reuse sector, it's with all sector when you read the news. I think that's kind of my change that I will ask.
Very good. Thank you for that. So at this time, what we're going to do is switch it over because I know Haley's been listening and wants to ask you a few questions himself. Haley?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm going to try not to put you on the spot too much, but I do have some questions. I guess just first of all, can you help us just understand the scale of this industry? I don't know exact number of people in the supply chain, dollars, pounds, but I'm just wondering if you could help us get a sense of how big this secondhand industry is.
Oof, I don't have that on top of my mind. I know there's like multiple different studies that quoted like regionally of like jobs employed. I know often, the Mitumba Consortium in Kenya, they say there's like 2 million people just in East Africa or in Kenya that are, involved in this trade. But globally, I don't have that figure on top of my mind. So I'm really sorry about
Talking
that.
about in the millions as opposed to hundreds of thousands or something like that.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely in the millions. But the exact number, I can't remember it.
Yeah, sure enough. Yeah, and I'm sure that exact number probably has some interpretation too. But
Exactly. Yeah, there's
you
multiple ways to estimate.
talked a lot about the economic and environmental benefits for these countries receiving these secondhand clothes. I'm just wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges that also come with it.
Economic challenges.
Not even just economic, but any challenges that sort of come with it. I'm thinking of like end of life, and I'm wondering where I'm trying to get to is what innovation we're seeing in some of these supply chains to kind of handle some of the emerging challenges that come.
I think this is a really good question because because I worked in Kenya and Tanzania in terms of waste management, is that I think number one, what we need to understand in the receiving country is that the issues that we see often in these images it's a reflection of a waste management system in the country, meaning that there is not a lot of operators, like in terms of coverage. And number two is that the landfill is often not well managed, right? So these are kind of like the systematic issues that we see is that all clothing, right, whether it's produced locally, whether it's imported new clothing or used clothing, do reach the end of life. Although that in these receiving countries that typically textile composition in terms of municipality waste is less than 3% of the total waste volume, it's relatively minimal. So I think a lot of these countries, the first question they always ask is, how do we just collect waste first? Collection is just the first question. And then number two is that how do we now, which fraction of the waste do we focus on, right? So if you look at in these countries, majority, I think like 40 to 60% is actually wet waste, like organic waste, they don't have a solution for. And the second largest fraction is plastic and then paper and metal and textiles kind of like the last of the last. So the countries typically ask, like in terms of like operators, we're on the ground when we work, we ask, okay, what is the most realistic investment for us to have the most amount of impact? And that would generate economic value according to Kenya or according to the context we live in. So I would say the issue at hand, like in textile in East Africa, is not that people don't want to set up recycling systems, that there is no buyer. So we don't have people who can buy recycle fiber and then spin it and make it economical for someone to then make it into an end product. Like these infrastructure are all missing for it to work. But whereas like in Panipat, like in India, in Pakistan, is that these industries are relatively developed. So they have the spinners, they have the recyclers, they have the end product producer. So that step of the process is possible. So I do see that, yes, in those countries, I think waste infrastructure is the key issue. And I think the question needs to be around how do we get people or the government to invest in infrastructure that would resolve this issue? Collection first, focusing on composting, focusing on material recovery facility first. Those are really key important things to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we see that in the U.S., where the textile waste is a similar percentage of overall waste. So, in terms of prioritizing, it's not always put near the top, just because of the volume. It seems like this secondhand industry is kind of grown organically, relatively informal, even sort of still emerging, relatively new. So I'm just trying to get a handle or some predictions maybe of where you see the industry going in the future. Again, like you were saying, if governments really invest and prioritize, what sort of advances do you see coming?
I think your question is like, what are the predictions? And I think I look at it from more of like macroeconomics, just because of the political context and like the rise of fuel, the decrease of disposable income, is that reuse is going to increase globally just because of what we're facing economically in general. So in terms of, receiving countries that they can't afford new clothing. Those who can will continue to buy because you see the trend of new clothing continue to increase along with used clothing continue to increase. Is that with the economic situation, I suspect that is going to continue to increase for a bit. But once the economy is stable, is that people do have aspiration to buy new clothes, right? They want to buy new items. So there may become a shift of buying new clothes eventually. But we don't really know just because of the political contacts and the trade issues, the shipment issues are happening right now.
It's crazy to think about how interconnected it is to all these other global macroeconomic trends. The industry can do everything right, and then some other trend happens somewhere else, and a new challenge appears.
Yeah, like shipping costs have gone up, right? So who's absorbing that cost? The consumer in the receiving country. And then just remember everything is going up here. Food is going up, fuel is going up. And it's important for us to understand that because in a lot of these countries, I think children are dropping out of school because they cannot afford the cost of living. I think that's so important for us to understand is that clothing is a minimal spending for most consumers in the receiving countries because they start off with housing, healthcare, education. These are the main pillars before they would think, before a mother would say, I need to buy a new piece of clothing, right? It's like, how do I pay for my school fee for my kids? That's the first question they want to ask. So all these things are happening. I think the trend is that I think as of right now, the economy, given the economy, there will be an increase in consumption, and that's not a bad thing. It's just because of affordability.
All right, last one. It's easy to imagine that collecting this data is difficult. I can imagine. So it's not surprising that there's kind of some of these inconsistencies between data and so I'm just wondering what are some of maybe the myths that you see emerge because of this inconsistency in collecting data or just the challenge of collecting the data. Sort of leave some room for interpretation. I'm wondering what you see.
Like, I can speak from my own experience because I find it very fun to collect data. Like, obviously, I'm Jennifer Wang, so I'm Asian descendant. And China is a large supplier globally. They're one of the largest suppliers in the world when it comes to used clothing. So when I go to these markets, the first thought the traders, when they see me, they said, she's a supplier. So when you're asking question, when we're first kind of in the first preliminary, we haven't even started collecting data. We just want to verify the supply chain, asking them questions. And we usually have like a translator and we have a professor that work with us. So the professor's observer just to see the interaction. So what we saw with the traders, they were speaking their own language and say, do you think she's a Chinese supplier? And they say, yeah, we think she's a Chinese supplier. I think we should tell her this so we can get better quality. So they're always negotiating. And so I have to really tell them, like, guys, I'm really not a Chinese supplier. And they don't believe it. So if they see a foreigner come, they think, are you an NGO that's going to give me free money? Or are they thinking, okay, are you a supplier that I can negotiate? Is this like an opportunity for me to negotiate and exaggerate or tell my story differently? So then we actually have to figure out how do we collect the data given the fact that I am Asian, I look like one of the suppliers. So we work with, it was so fun to figure that process out.
Mhm.
So we work with like local students, we have to train them properly. We have like survey supervisors that are, they're PhD students that serve PhD doctorate professors that supervise, train them, ask further questions because we realize that when you ask someone to say, okay, how much do you throw away? Then I might say, okay, I throw away this percentage. But then what they meant is that I throw away, what I consider throw away is I don't sell it at the price that I want to sell it at.
Wow.
I throw it away because I feel like I want to have items that, I can make more profit. But the reality is that they don't have more money to buy you know, more expensive goods. It's just like a reality of supply and demand, right? So the question is always about when you're doing your research, you need to have multiple layers to verify the question because the interview can be very emotional for the people. I'm sure if you ask me, if the interview goes on for 2, 3 hours, I may contradict myself at one point or another, right? So you just want to verify and ask me multiple questions to make sure this is what I mean when I answer something. So that's a really key factor. Also, we looked at like, depending on which part of the supply chain you interview, is the answer varies. So you need to take it into account, right? So you need to validate through the supply chain. You can't just stop where you want it to stop. You have to like really track the whole system to understand what really happens to have a big picture. So I would say that these are kind of the learnings that we have on our end.
Yeah,
I hope
interesting.
that answers your question.
It's very good.
I'm not sure, but that was really interesting. Just trying to imagine collecting this data and all the competing interests that are going in, and how can I skew my data to get the outcome I want? It's got to
Yeah,
be a real quagmire to try to wade through. So I appreciate that.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, that's all I have, Monica. I turn it back over to you.
And yeah, and I just have one more question because you find yourself in a unique career path, and I wanted to just ask a little bit about if someone wants to get involved in this type of a sustainable career, how would you advise them to do it? And one thing that you said that I absolutely loved was that you used to think this data stuff was so nerdy, but now you're kind of like this is a good romance novel or something. So
I picture like an Indiana Jones sort of
I wanted to be Indiana Jones when I was growing up. So yeah.
hidden data.
so I'm thinking about high school students who are trying to think of what they might want to do, college students, or even someone in the midst of transition. How would they begin going down a track like this, especially if they have interests in sustainability and traceability and things like that?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to speak from like a cultural context, obviously, because I think how your environment shapes you. So for me was that I was more rebellious. Just for a long time, I wanted to be a doctor. It was like either you become a doctor or engineers, and as a Asian household, and my dad is a doctor, so I wanted to do that for a long time. And I think the critical point at one point in someone's life, you have to ask yourself is like, what is something I'm really passionate about learning and that the risk and the reward is worth it, right? It's like you need to, like for me, it was like I took a leap of faith to get into international development. I had an opportunity. So I built a skill first. The first thing is that you want to ask yourself, what is a skill that I can offer if I want to get into this field, whether it's data or even accounting or even project management, what is the skill that I have that makes me employable? And then the topic can change. You can go from, for me, like I start off with latrines to, to waste management, to farming, to access to finance. But the skill that I was bringing to each of those companies was the same exact thing, but just different topic that I was dealing with. So I think that's the first thing that, as a young person, is that do something you're really good at, and then the topic will come to you. It will continue to change and shape, and don't feel the pressure of saying, I want to get somewhere right away. It's like, I never imagined I'd work in used clothing, or I never imagined that I would, work in scaling sanitation toilets right after college. It's not a very, it's not a very ideal topic to look at, right? But it led me to where I am. So number one is build the skill you have and listen to your inner voice, and don't feel the pressure of comparison. And I know that's really difficult. And so from that way, I think your passion leads to door opening, right? Even to have this opportunity to speak at this podcast was, I think I was just speaking at an event, happened to be very passionate. I got into this industry only, I think, about 3 years ago because I was so curious. What do we do with our textile? Because I'm an over shopper. I'm a consumer. I love fashion. I buy too much stuff. And so at that point, I read some report online, bought a one-way ticket to India. I called some friends, who knew factory owners in India. I just got in, learned about it, read everything, saw everything that I read in the report. And then I continued my journey, and I just met incredible people. Like, if you talk to people, as I said, people they have good intention. People want to help you. If you show that you're passionate, you can offer a skill, they will give you opportunities to work with them. I think that would be my advice for people who want to get into it, is don't be afraid. Take a leap of faith, reach out to people. Don't be shy, shamelessly LinkedIn messaging people, emailing people. And now they're my mentor, and they're still my mentor, but now we work closely together in collaboration, which is really exciting.
That's awesome. I love that answer. Thank you so much for doing that. Because I know that there's somebody who's listening and like, wow, how can I do this? How can I get into this? So thank you for that answer.
Feel free to
Haley?
reach out to me on LinkedIn also. So
Yeah.
if they want to learn.
Yeah, that's great career advice. I wish I would have gotten that when I was younger, for sure. All right. Well, thank you, Monica. A few reminders for our listeners on the way out. If you want to stay connected with us and stay informed about the latest sustainable solutions, don't forget to subscribe. And please share with your friends and family and colleagues. Together, we can make a difference. And remember, change starts with awareness and action. So let's keep the conversation going. Feel free to reach out to us on social media, through our website, share your thoughts, ideas, and stories with us. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, remember, it's a big world out there, but every small change counts. Together, we can build a better, more sustainable future. Thank you all.
Thank you.